Offshore wind power is expanding rapidly. It's reached 29.1 gigawatts of generating capacity in 2019. Those are global numbers. And a new study suggests that a subsector of that industry, the floating wind platforms, is primed for significant growth between now and 2023. So 2033. So I'm going to be speaking to Paul H. Hillegiest from Texas-based Quest Floating Wind Energy LLC about the industry. They did the study. And welcome to the interview, Paul.
Thank you so much, Markham. I appreciate being here.
Well, look, let's start with an overview of your study. So if you could just give us a brief recap, please.
Yes. Well, to those who are not as familiar, floating wind is an extrapolation really of the historical offshore wind, which is happening rather rapidly over the last 1 to 2 decades, mostly in Europe and Asia, but that footprint is growing. And the floating wind is an extension of what we call bottom fixed or fixed wind, which is relatively closer to shore, still offshore, but closer to shore and more traditional mechanisms. The floating technology, floating wind technology, is a newer technology, advanced technology that's being applied to the segment to offer larger capacities, essentially, and in areas that have no other opportunity for wind unless it were floating, like South Korea, the west coast of the US, and Hawaii are examples of deep water very near to shore where there aren't any other solutions available relative to offshore wind.
Well, let me ask a question. This is probably going through the minds of our viewers as well. And that is, how much rough sea can these platforms take? My imagination suggests that there's, I could see them toppling over or being capsized. Is that a danger?
Well, no, it's not a danger relative to the robust design and engineering of the structures. Similar to offshore oil and gas, which has been around the globe for more than 40 years, much of this experience is being extrapolated, if you will, from that industry into this newer renewable segment of the industry. So it's proven many years of experience in mooring the structures for high sea states like you would have in the North Sea, or typhoon conditions in Asia, hurricane conditions in the US as an example, west, Gulf of Mexico, west, east coast. So that's just sort of the day one of the holistic approach is they're permanent installations.
Paul, now, what is the potential here? Because I imagine that if you put a wind turbine offshore, it's likely to get much more consistent wind than you would onshore. You can maybe make it higher than you could onshore. You don't have visual issues with people in the area. Have I got that right?
Yes, absolutely. The evolution of what we're seeing in wind to offshore, as I mentioned earlier, initially in the shallower water shelf areas of the oceans into the deeper water, there's both site-specific demand for power, as Japan and South Korea are good examples, as well as more energy resource, more wind resource source the farther you go. And then these structures, because the roads and highways and the infrastructure and the rail are limited to certain sizes, the offshore will be shipped and assembled by with marine going vessels to where you don't have the constraints of bridges and roads and things like that. These structures are quite large. The bigger turbines are as high as the Shard in London.
So amongst my engineering friends, they talk a lot about capacity factors. And I understand, if I remember correctly, onshore wind capacity factors are now getting up in the 40 to 50% range. Have I got that right? And are we expecting?
Yes.
Okay, so are we expecting to see deep offshore with significantly higher capacity factors than what you would see onshore?
In order to deliver on the technology, which is more expensive at the moment, and will likely be more expensive than other methods, but the scale is vastly different. And yes, the capacities will need to be there. And our experience right now is the high 50s to 60s for installations that have been in service, like off Scotland, for example, one of the first commercial installations by Equinor off Scotland, Highland, Scotland, been in operation, and there's lots of data that it's 60% is maybe even be conservative capacity factors.
Now, one of the things I found interesting is that of the existing 9 floating wind projects, Equinor, the Norwegian oil company, owns 6 of them. And I guess that makes perfect sense. If this is based on offshore oil and gas technology, then it would be almost a straight transfer of expertise and so on from those kinds of companies like Equinor. Should we expect in the next 10, 20 years to see more of those kinds of companies, particularly the Europeans, getting into offshore floating wind?
Yes, we already have. Last year was a big watermark, high mark, if you will, or a milestone for others like Equinor entering the sector. Those being Total Energies, the French energy company, Shell, the Dutch energy company, and BP more recently, the UK energy company, all entering the space very aggressively, spending dedicated billions of spend to secure offshore licenses and at auction and develop their business strategies to participate in this new segment.
Gotcha. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Out to 2035, your study forecasts $96 billion in capital expenditures, which is no small amount, and forecast capacity additions of about 26 gigawatts, powered by almost 2,700 floating turbine units, and most of that growth going into Asia Pacific and Northern Europe. Have I got that correct?
Yes. The UK has been both conventional fixed wind as well as floating wind now very aggressive at growing their offshore wind industries. Similarly, Asia, Taiwan, Korea, South Korea, Japan, more countries, but those are the key countries driving the growth, particularly in floating as we speak. The US West Coast, around the middle of the decade, we'll see a couple of projects growing to more before 2030. So that will be ultimately long-term, that will be expected to be a big market towards the later end of our forecast for sure.
Sounds good. Well, look, this has been very enlightening, Paul. Thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, and hi to everyone out there. I think you're doing a great job sharing this this technology and the new energy with your students and all the others. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thanks, sir.